But I'm proud of my, hey, I went to the Wharton School of Finance. I was a really good student.
I went to an Ivy League college. I was a nice student. I did very well. I'm a very intelligent person.
Everybody knows what a great school it is. Look, if I were a liberal Democrat, people would say I'm the super genius of all time.
No, they wouldn't. Donald Trump, in his typically modest fashion, bragging in no shortage of degree about how smart he is and also his educational bona fides. But the Washington Post, they did a deep dive into his academic career, and it is not nearly as impressive as Trump would make it sound. The Post, they spoke to an admissions officer who was there at the time named James Nolan. He says the acceptance rate in 1966 was at 50%, and it was even higher for transfers like Donald Trump, who went to Fordham first. Nolan also told the Post he was not impressed with Trump's intellect. Quote, I certainly was not struck by any sense that I'm sitting before a genius, certainly not a super genius. Nolan also said, quote, it was not very difficult to get into Wharton at that time. The article also points out that Trump was not one of the top honorees at graduation, and he wasn't even on the dean's list. Plus, Trump is, of course, refusing to release his transcripts. This classic Trump won't show his transcript, but he said this tweet in 2012 asking to see President Obama's academic records, saying, quote, isn't it time that Obama release his college records and applications? Boy, would that create a mess. He's not who you think. Now, a year earlier, Trump, he had this to say about Obama.
He was a terrible student. Terrible. He went to Occidental. I heard he was a terrible student. Not like, okay, I heard he was a bad student. How does a bad student then go to Columbia and then go to Harvard? How does this happen?
Well, my next guest wrote the piece that we've been talking about, Michael Kranish. He is national political investigative reporter for the Washington Post, and Andrew sat down with him earlier today.
Michael, you've done some terrific reporting on Trump and Wharton. Before we get to the details of what you found, I'm curious, what was your motivation for doing this investigation?
Well, Donald Trump has said for years that he is the top student at Wharton. He said he's heard he's the top student at Wharton. Whenever people have questioned his intellect, he's referred to getting a degree at Wharton, said it was the hardest school to get into. So essentially I wanted to see if that was true and find out what exactly happened in getting into Wharton.
I know that an admissions officer at Wharton that you spoke with said he certainly didn't think that Trump was a genius, but he also knew the Wharton's acceptance rate was, at the time, was over 40% of the applicants who applied got in. I'm wondering if the implication in this piece is that Trump might not have gotten in without help, or that his acceptance by Wharton should be taken should not be taken as proof that he's as intelligent and as good a student as he claimed.
Right. Well, by Trump saying it was the hardest school to get into, I wanted to see if that was true. It is not the hardest school to get into. When we think of Wharton today, you might think of the graduate school. This was the undergraduate school of finance at the University of Pennsylvania. So also today, to get into University of Pennsylvania, the acceptance rate is 7.4%. It's an Ivy League school. It is very hard to get into. At the time Trump went to University of Pennsylvania in 1966, the acceptance rate was more than 50%. It was not that difficult to get into by any stretch, certainly compared to today. And he was a transfer student. He'd already done 2 years at Fordham in the Bronx. And those transfer students usually got in much easier than freshman students. So part of it was an effort to see if it was true what Trump said in saying it was the hardest school to get into, since he refers to this again and again. So I was able to track down the admissions officer who reviewed his file, and he remembered the case very well. And he did tell me that this was not a difficult school to get into. Trump has claimed that getting into Wharton shows he's a, quote, super genius, quote unquote. The admissions officer said he didn't think he saw a genius sitting in front of him. That's a very high bar. So it's Trump's own standards that I was looking at, not some random look. I mean, he had set the bar very high, saying it was the hardest school and there was super genius stuff to get in.
And of course, this being Donald Trump, there are some mitigating factors of his own creation that factor in here as well. He's refused to release his college transcripts. In fact, Michael Cohen testified that he threatened Trump's schools with legal action if they leaked the grades. We also know that Trump tried to make a scandal out of President Obama's school records. So how uncommon is it for a president not to release their scholastic data?
Well, scholastic data is not something that typically has to be released. Some people do release it. I've done stories about candidates who've released their transcripts. It's really the onus here is on Trump. He challenged Obama in 2011 to release his college transcripts. And he said he heard, quote unquote, that Obama was a, quote, terrible student, and then he challenged him to put the records out. So having said that about Obama, and given the story we just described that I wrote about Trump, it seems fair to ask, would Trump release his own transcripts? He not only has refused to do that, but as you mentioned, his lawyer told the colleges during the campaign that they would be sued if they did release the transcripts. They have no right to release the transcripts. There was no threat they would do so. So the lawyer going to them really wasn't necessary, but it underscored how Trump didn't want those grades, for whatever reason, to get out.
Well, then let me ask this from the other end of the telescope. Can you recall an elected official working this hard to keep his or her college grades a secret?
Well, I don't know if you can compare anybody to Trump for a whole host of reasons, but I will tell you an anecdote. I covered John Kerry's campaign back in 2004, and there was a controversy then about should John Kerry release every bit of his military records. He did eventually release a lot of his military records, but the one thing in those records that he didn't release, he later did release after the campaign was over. And the only thing that was missing from his records were his college grades at Yale, and they weren't that great during a freshman year, as I recall it. Some D's in there, in fact. So he did put that out after the campaign. He was thinking of running again. He wanted the question to go away. So it does show you that there's a great sensitivity there by some candidates about how their grades will look. What's different here is that Trump has said he's done so great, hardest school to get into, super genius stuff, said he'd heard he was first in his class. None of that was correct as far as the being the hardest school or first in his class. In fact, the dean's list of 56 top students does not include Trump's name. So clearly he was not first in his class.
Michael, do we know if he got any help from his family to get in? We know that Trump's older brother, Fred Jr., wanted to go to Wharton and did not get in, but Donald did. You would think if the family was helping, they both would have gotten in. Do we know if they helped? Do we know if the family pulled a Kushner and just wrote the school a check to try to grease the skids?
I looked at the financial contributions records. They don't show any check contribution during those years, but some of them are anonymous, so I can't conclusively say they didn't contribute money. I do tell the anecdote, which is important to understand here, which is that a very close friend of Donald Trump's brother was the admissions officer who were interviewed. James Nolan was best friends with Fred Trump Jr., who was the admissions officer in the story. So he called up his friend saying, can you interview Donald Trump to get into Wharton? And his friend said, sure. And his friend gave Donald Trump a rating that was probably good enough to get in. And then his supervisor, who did not interview Donald Trump, did approve his admission. So that's another part of the story that I tell.
Final question, Michael. If anybody checked my transcripts from college, they would not be flattering, and in my mind, would not really be a good indication of the man or the professional that I've become. I'm wondering if you think we should give Trump the same benefit and what your takeaway of Trump the man and Trump the president was as a result of you looking into Trump the college student.
Well, the point here is that Trump is the one who set the bar high. I don't doubt that you're a great news broadcaster, notwithstanding whatever grades you might have gotten, and a lot of people do great without getting great grades. Some people drop out of college and go on to found multi-billion-dollar companies. So that's not the point. The point here is that Trump has said it was the hardest school to get into. It wasn't. And he said that he heard he was first in his class, and he wasn't. So there was an effort to basically check all the things that he has said, because he brings up his Wharton background time and time and time again.
And the piece is a terrific read. Job well done. Michael Kranish is the national political investigative reporter with the Washington Post. Michael, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
And coming up next, scare tactics, nothing new in politics. For President Trump, he's taking things to a whole new level. After the break, we'll show you what we mean.